At the height of the American Gilded Age, on a Monday in the last week of March in 1883, a carriage moved slowly north along Fifth Avenue in New York, in the direction of the newly finished mansion at number 660. Inside the carriage sat a woman of 52 in a heavy silk day dress and gloves, whose maid had that morning laid out the visiting cards on a small silver salver and set the salver on her mistress's dressing table without comment. The mistress had, without comment, taken one. The card was engraved on white pasteboard in the plain script of Tiffany. It bore at its center a single line. Mrs. Astor, the mansion at 665th Avenue was called, in the newspapers of that spring, the Petit Chateau. It had been built for a young woman named Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt at a cost of just over $1 million, in a style of French Gothic that had never previously been erected on Fifth Avenue, and that was, in the neighborhood's private opinion, faintly hysterical. The woman in the carriage had not, before that afternoon, entered it. She had not entered it, in strict fact, that afternoon either. She had gone up the steps, handed her card to the footman at the door, and returned to the carriage without a word. And now, unhurriedly, in the manner of a woman who had made a small and necessary payment in a currency she despised, she was going home. Her name was Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor. She was, at that particular hour on that particular afternoon, the acknowledged head of what the American newspapers had, over the previous decade, taken to calling the 400, the aristocratic society of New York, which was, by the private measurements of Fifth Avenue, also the aristocratic society of the entire United States. She had, for something in the vicinity of 20 years, exercised a form of authority in New York that no woman before or since has quite exercised in any American city. She had decided, by a series of small gestures whose accumulated effect was very large, which families were admitted into the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue and which were not. She had done this not through wealth alone, though her family and her husband's family together commanded a share of the New York real estate market that no other family in the city could rival. She had done it, instead, through a talent for restraint. She had never, so far as any surviving record shows, raised her voice in public. She had never, in a career of almost 4 decades, permitted her private emotions to appear on her face at a table. She had understood from very early in her life that the point of an aristocratic society was not to admit, it was to exclude. And she had understood, from equally early, that a society whose rules were written down was already dead. That afternoon, in a carriage moving north along Fifth Avenue, she had submitted to a rule that was not written down, but that had been, over the preceding weeks, set out with unmistakable clarity by another woman 32 years her junior. If Mrs. Astor wished to have her daughter Carrie invited to the great fancy dress ball that was to be given the following evening at 665th Avenue, then Mrs. Astor was required first to have paid a formal social call at that house. She had never paid such a call. She had, until that morning, considered such a call impossible. It was not impossible now. The card had been left. In the morning, an invitation would arrive. She would attend the ball. She would be one of nearly 1,200 guests in costumes taken from Van Dyck and Bronzino, in a house whose ballroom was hung with orchids from South America. She would leave, according to the newspapers of the following week, sometime after 2 in the morning. She would speak, in the days that followed, to almost no one about what she thought of the evening. But something had shifted in the small transit of a card across a footman's tray. And in the 25 years that followed, until her own death, on a grey autumn morning in 1908, in the same mansion in which she had lived her married life, nothing in the aristocratic society of New York would ever quite be the same again. This is the story of Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, of the ballroom she built, of the list her friend Ward McAllister compiled, of the nephew whose hotel she could see from her own front windows, and of the summer nights and winter nights of a New York that she, more than any other single person, had willed into existence, and that she would, in her last conscious years, watch without complaint come to an end. If you enjoy long-form documentaries on the great dynasties of old money, subscribe. New episodes every tea. There are, in the New York of the early 19th century, two families whose union in 1853 would produce the woman who is the subject of this account. Neither of them was, at that date, especially fashionable. Both of them were something older, and in the particular grammar of New York money, something better than fashionable. They were established. The first was the Schermerhorn family. They had come to New Amsterdam in the 1630s from a village of the same name near Alkmaar in the northern Netherlands. They had, over the following 2 centuries, made themselves prosperous in shipping, in ship chandlery, in the small and steady trades of a port city. They had bought land where land was still to be had and had held it. By the 1830s, when the child who would become Caroline was born, the extended Schermerhorn family occupied a broad section of what was, at that moment, the fashionable southern end of Manhattan, in houses whose furniture was Dutch, and whose portraits, in gilt frames, showed men in the black hats of the Reformed Church, and women whose hair was covered by starched linen caps. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was born on the 22nd of September, 1830, at number 1 Greenwich Street, near the Bowling Green. She was the youngest of 9 children of Abraham Schermerhorn, a merchant of considerable standing, and of Helen White. When she was very small, the family moved north, as prosperous New York families of the 1830s tended to move north, to a new house on Bond Street, near the fashionable Lafayette Place, which had been developed by the fur trader John Jacob Astor. She was educated by a French émigré named Madame Bency, whose small school on Union Square accepted the daughters of the Knickerbocker families and refused those of everybody else. She was taken in her adolescence to Europe, to Paris, and to Rome, and returned at the age of 20 with the languages and the piano and the small store of remembered watercolors that were considered in her generation the proper equipment of a bride. The other family was the Astor family. They were much richer than the Schermerhorns and considerably younger. Their fortune had been made, in the first quarter of the 19th century, by a single man of formidable and disagreeable talents, the fur trader John Jacob Astor, a German immigrant from Waldorf in the Rhineland-Palatinate, who had arrived in New York in 1784 with almost nothing and had, by the time of his death in 1848, become, by the standards of any of the calculations made at the time, the richest man in America. He had done this first through the fur trade in the Great Lakes and the Pacific Northwest. Then, when the fur trade began to decline, by turning the proceeds of his sales into New York real estate, which he had acquired in enormous quantities, at prices that would, within 1 generation, look absurd. Old John Jacob had 2 sons who survived him. The elder, William Backhouse Astor Sr., was a slow, cautious, humorless man who spent his entire adult life administering the properties his father had assembled. He was known in the newspapers of the 1860s as the landlord of New York, and he lived in a plain and darkened brownstone on Lafayette Place in a manner so unshowy that visiting Europeans, expecting to find an American Croesus, generally left disappointed. He and his wife, Margaret Rebecca Armstrong, daughter of a United States Senator, had 3 sons and 3 daughters. The eldest son, John Jacob Astor III, was the family's designated heir. The middle son, William Backhouse Astor Jr., was born on the 12th of July, 1829. He was, from an early age, understood not to be greatly interested in either the family fortune or the family business. What he was interested in was horses, yachts, hunting, and the company of men who were also interested in those things. He was, by temperament, everything his father was not. In the autumn of 1853, at Trinity Church at the foot of Wall Street, William Backhouse Astor Jr. married Caroline Webster Schermerhorn. He was 24. She was 23. The marriage had been arranged in the usual way, through the mediation of relatives on both sides, without any particular urgency. It joined 2 families of impeccable New York standing. The husband was rich, though he would not, in either his father's lifetime or his elder brother's, be the heir. The wife brought a considerable inheritance of her own, enough at the time it was settled, to make her, throughout her married life, financially independent of her husband to a degree that few other American wives of her generation would ever be. The wedding was quiet. They would have 5 children. The eldest, Emily, was born in 1854. She would elope in 1876 with a socialite named James Van Allen against her father's wishes and would die in Newport in November 1881, some months after the birth of her third child at the age of 27. The second, Helen Schermerhorn Astor, born in 1855, would marry James Roosevelt, the half-brother of a future president, and would die young herself in 1893. The third, Charlotte Augusta, born in March 1858, would give her mother in the summer of 1892 the private grief we shall come to. The fourth, Caroline, universally called Carrie in the family, was born in October 1861. The fifth and last, John Jacob Astor IV, was born at the family's country place at Rhinebeck on the 13th of July, 1864. For the first 15 years of the marriage, Carolyn Astor was a young mother in a large and increasingly prosperous household. In 1862, she and her husband commissioned a substantial brownstone on the newly fashionable Fifth Avenue at number 350 at the corner of 34th Street. The building was in the four-bay brownstone style that had, in the 1860s, only just begun to be considered a permissible material for a serious New York house. Fifth Avenue itself in that decade was in the process of being redefined. It had, until the Civil War, been a residential street of moderate pretension. It was becoming, in the years after, the corridor along which the fortunes of the country would arrange themselves, one mansion at a time, in a slow and expensive procession northward. The Astor's new house was next door to the house of her husband's elder brother, John Jacob Astor III, whose wife Charlotte Augusta Gibbs was, in the fashion of the Astor family, exceptionally difficult and, in the fashion of certain sisters-in-law, exceptionally unloved. The two Mrs. Astors were neighbors for 28 years. They did not, in that time, become friends. It was said by observers of both households that Charlotte Augusta considered Caroline an upstart, a Dutch merchant's daughter who had married above her station, and that Caroline, in her own private evaluation, considered Charlotte Augusta a colorless woman who had, by the accident of her marriage to the elder brother, been given a rank she would not have earned in any other way. The two views were, it should be said, not incompatible. Both may have been correct. There is not, in the surviving correspondence, very much evidence of what Caroline felt in the first 15 years of her marriage. There is evidence of what she did. She kept the accounts of the household. She managed the servants. She took the children to Rhinebeck in the summer and to Newport in the late summer, and when their father's yacht was in a port that was convenient, she took them to see him. She endured, as the wives of yachtsmen and racehorse breeders endured, the extended absences of a husband whose interest lay elsewhere. There is a small anecdote from those years that surfaces again and again in the memoirs of people who knew her. On the evenings when Caroline was giving one of her small early receptions, she was said to hold her husband at his club as long as possible in order to prevent him from returning to Fifth Avenue too early. She had good reason. Her husband, when he did return, was in the habit of telling the orchestra to stop playing and sending the children of the family to bed. He believed that the whole enterprise of society was a form of undignified fuss. His wife had, by that point, begun to arrive at a rather different view. By the middle of the 1860s, Caroline Astor was 35 years old. She was the mother of 5 children. She was one of the two Mrs. Astors of Fifth Avenue, and she had begun, in a way that no one who observed her socially would yet have named, to imagine a project. The project was very simple, and it was almost impossibly ambitious. It was to preserve, in the middle of a city that was in the process of being transformed by newly arrived money at a rate no city in the history of Europe had ever quite experienced, the small, self-selected, and quietly self-satisfied society of the old New York families into which she had been born. Nothing about the project required any particular material investment. The Astor fortune was already, by the 1860s, greater than any private fortune in the country. What the project required, instead, was a system. It required a set of rules, none of which could ever be written down, and all of which had, in the vocabulary of every ambitious hostess in New York, to be perfectly understood. She would spend, from the middle of the 1860s onward, the next 40 years constructing that system. She would construct it in a series of small gestures at balls and receptions, in the pattern of invitations she chose to send, and the invitations she chose not to send, in the tables at which she arranged the seating at her Monday dinners, in the visits she chose to return, and the visits she chose to leave unanswered. Every one of these gestures was, in isolation, unimportant. Collected over 4 decades, they became, in the American press of the 1880s, the single most powerful cultural instrument any American woman had ever wielded. The New York into which Caroline Schermerhorn Astor had married in 1853 was, in point of population, a city of just over 500,000. The New York in which she began in the second half of the 1860s to receive at Fifth Avenue was a city of nearly 1 million and rising. The Civil War had ended. The immense fortunes that would define the Gilded Age were already forming in railways and in oil and in industrial iron and in Western silver. Men whom no Knickerbocker family had ever heard of were arriving in Manhattan every month, buying houses on Madison Square and on Fifth Avenue and on the newly fashionable lots north of Union Square. Some of them had children they wished to place. Some of them had wives who had begun to imagine themselves as hostesses. Caroline Astor watched this arrival with something that was, in her own mind, more nearly close to alarm than to anything else. She had grown up in the closed world of the Knickerbocker families, the descendants of the Dutch and English settlers who had, in her own understanding, made New York, and whose particular manners were, in her own view, all that separated New York from being merely a larger, colder, and less legitimate version of Chicago. Those manners could not be codified. That was the essential thing about them. But they could, she was beginning to understand, be defended. They could be defended by a specific instrument, which was the invitation. At number 355th Avenue, in a ballroom that took up much of the top floor of the house, Caroline Astor began, in the years between 1865 and 1870, to give the parties that would define the rest of her life. The ballroom had, by design and by measurement, room for exactly 400 people. It was said later that she had specified this figure to her architect. This is almost certainly a piece of legend. What is not legend is that the number 400, as an approximation of the capacity of the room, was, over the coming 20 years, going to become the single most famous small number in the vocabulary of American money. She held a formal ball in that room on the third Monday of every January. She held smaller receptions at intervals throughout the winter. She was, throughout that decade, in mourning for one relation or another. The aristocratic New York of the 1870s was, by modern standards, spent in an almost continuous state of black. But when she was not in mourning, and sometimes even when she was, the ballroom on Fifth Avenue was, by common agreement of the newspapers that were beginning, in that same decade to notice such things, the single most important room in New York society. It was not the most beautiful room. The most beautiful rooms in New York in the 1870s were being built by men whose names Caroline Astor had never intended to add to any list. New railroad men, new bankers, new industrialists whose ballrooms were larger than hers, whose paintings were more expensive than hers, whose orchestras were paid more than hers. It was not, materially, the grandest room. What it was, and what those other rooms were not, was the room from which one either had or had not been sent an engraved card. To receive that card was, in the private vocabulary of New York in the 1870s, to have arrived. To fail to receive it was, in the same vocabulary, not so much to have failed as to have not quite become. There were people of enormous wealth in New York in that decade, men whose fortunes had been made, in some case, only 15 years earlier, who did not, for a decade or more, receive the card. Some of them died still hoping. Some of them arrived, in the end, only through their grandchildren. At the door of that ballroom and at the writing desk on which the cards were prepared, sat a woman who had, by the middle of the 1870s, ceased to seek the approval of anyone at all outside the small circle of her own approval. She wore at those receptions a considerable quantity of jewelry, several ropes of pearls, a diamond stomacher of astonishing size, a tiara that had been made for her by Tiffany. She was said by observers who noticed such things to wear them ostentatiously. She was also said, by the same observers, to have earned the right to do so. Her portraits from those years, by Carolus Duran and later by others, show a woman of medium height, dark-eyed, with a mouth that had, over the years, arranged itself into an expression neither warm nor unwarm, but arbitrating. She was not beautiful. She had not been beautiful even at 20. What she was unmistakable. She could not, however, do the work alone. No single hostess in a city of 1 million people could hold together by herself the boundary between old and new. She required an instrument. She required a man who was clever, socially ambitious, endlessly available, and, in a particular way that would prove important, not quite one of them. She found him in Ward McAllister. Samuel Ward McAllister had been born in Savannah, Georgia, on the 28th of December, 1827. His family, though not particularly rich, had been socially adjacent to the small planter aristocracy of the American South. His uncle Samuel Ward, on his mother's side, had been a New York banker. His cousin Julia Ward Howe would later write the words to a well-known American war song. In 1850, at the age of 22, he had moved with his father to California and had, in the manner of the early gold rush, made a small fortune at the bar in San Francisco within 2 years. In 1853, the same year in which Caroline Schermerhorn had married William Astor, Jr., he had married his own cousin, Sarah Taintor Gibbons, and had, quite deliberately, retired from the practice of law. What he wished to do, from that year onward, was to be a member of the highest possible society. He had lived in his 20s in Paris and in London. He had studied with what one biographer has called the concentration of a young priest, the arrangements of the aristocratic dinner. He had returned to America with a set of settled opinions on the correct method of arranging a table, the correct wines to serve with each course, the correct duration of the interval between the arrival of the guests and the announcement of dinner. He had also returned with a settled ambition to be indispensable. He arrived in New York in the early 1860s. Within a decade, he was, by his own account and by that of the newspapers, the acknowledged arbiter of taste for the small society into which he had, by means that were never entirely clear, inserted himself. He was very slightly ridiculous. He had a small pointed beard, wore high collars long after they had ceased to be fashionable, and had a slight Georgia accent that he had never quite lost. What he also had, however, was a talent for organizing a party that no other man in New York could match, and a set of opinions on society that agreed in every particular with those of Caroline Astor. She called him, in the private correspondence of those years, her mystic rose. In 1872, together they founded the Society of the Patriarchs. It was, in its structure, a small revolution in the way American society was to be governed. The patriarchs were 25 men. The number was carefully chosen, whose names would be, according to the founding statute drafted by McAllister, of unquestioned respectability, worth, and responsibility. Each patriarch was permitted, at every ball of the coming season, to invite 4 ladies and 5 gentlemen. The lists were vetted in the drawing room at 350 Fifth Avenue by Caroline Astor. What they had created, without ever quite admitting to themselves that they had created it, was an American peerage without titles. It was a peerage whose members would not be listed in Debrets or in Berks, and whose privileges could not be inherited by law. But it was a peerage nonetheless. Its members could be recognized by the fact of their invitations to the patriarch's balls. Its non-members could be recognized by the absence of the same invitations. And its administration was, over the following 20 years, the joint work, public and private, verbal and unspoken show, of the woman in the ballroom on Fifth Avenue and the man in the dark coat who stood, at her instruction, at the door. At the same time, in the summers of the same decade, they were carrying out a parallel operation at Newport, Rhode Island. Newport had been, before the 1870s, a small and rather sleepy summer town on the coast of the Narragansett Bay, favored by a few Boston Brahmins and by a scattering of families from Providence. Under McAllister's direction, and with Caroline Astor's summer presence increasingly acknowledged as the anchor of the season, it became something entirely different. It became the American Deauville. It became the place where, over an 8-week season stretching from the middle of July to the middle of September, the social hierarchy that had been erected during the winter in New York was, in a more relaxed but no less exact form, maintained. The details in the memoirs that survive are enchanting and slightly absurd. McAllister gave picnics on a farm outside the town, where each family invited was required to bring a specified contribution: a basket of grapes, a quart of ice cream, several bottles of champagne. He himself provided, at the more elaborate of these events, a filet de boeuf piqué, oven-roasted and larded, in quantities that would today serve a small restaurant. Attendance at these picnics was, in his own words, the stepping stone to the best New York society. Absence was noticed. Repeat invitation was construction of a career. In 1881, in the middle of this Newport period, the Astors bought a large summer house on Bellevue Avenue called Beechwood. It had a ballroom capable, according to the fond estimate of its subsequent visitors, of holding the entire 400. From that year onward until the beginning of the 20th century, Beechwood was the summer capital of the empire that Caroline Astor and Ward McAllister had, between them, been constructing since the founding of the patriarchs. A visitor to Beechwood in one of those summers, and there were many, though never as many as the estimate of 400, because the ballroom in fact held closer to 350 pun, would have been struck, above all, by the exactness of the arrangements. Cards were not, on any evening, sent to guests who had failed to reciprocate an invitation of the preceding season. Seatings at dinner were established in advance and were not, once established, revised. Conversation was expected to move, over the course of an evening, through a set of subjects in an order that had been prearranged by the hostess and confirmed at each end of the table by the men who were seated there. Politics were not discussed. Business was not discussed. Anything that had happened in any American newspaper during the preceding week was not to be alluded to in any way that would require any guest to hold an opinion about it. The effect on those who attended was that of moving through a very slow and very carefully choreographed piece of theater, in which the plot had been agreed by the parties in advance, and in which any deviation from the agreed lines was noticed. The effect on those who were not admitted was quite different. The effect on them was of being informed, without a single word being spoken, that some form of existence which was going on very close to their own was, in the eyes of the people conducting it, invisible to them. The empire had not, in 1881, yet acquired its name. The name would arrive, quite by accident, 7 years later. On the 24th of March, 1888, in a hotel dining room in Manhattan, Ward McAllister sat down with a reporter from the New York Tribune. He had been giving interviews at intervals for years. His indispensability to the aristocratic society of Fifth Avenue was, by the middle 1880s, no longer even faintly in doubt. He had, if anything, become slightly wary of confirming it. But the newspapers of the 1880s were becoming, with each passing year, more insistent. The public wanted to know who was in and who was out. The public had begun to buy newspapers on the strength of the answers. McAllister sat down at the table. He allowed himself, on this occasion, a certain expansiveness. He explained in his careful Savannah manner what was and was not permissible at a New York dinner. He explained who might and might not properly be invited to a ball. And then, in a sentence which he had never spoken quite so plainly before, he explained the following. There are only about 400 people, he said, in fashionable New York society. He went on. If you go outside that number, he said, you strike people who are either not at ease in a ballroom or who make other people not at ease. The reporter, who was called, in the small credit at the top of the column, a gentleman of the Tribune, wrote it down. The column was published within the week. It was reprinted within the fortnight across the country. By the summer of that year, the phrase "the 400" had entered the American language. and had, in the mouths of Americans who had never met Ward McAllister or Caroline Astor or any member of any patriarch's ball, become the standard shorthand for the entire aristocratic society of the United States. It had, moreover, taken on a numerical coincidence that would attach itself to the phrase forever. 400 was, according to McAllister, the number of people who were in society. It was also, according to the memory of anyone who had ever attended a patriarch's ball at Fifth Avenue, roughly the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The two facts, in the language of the American press, became one. The 400 were the number of people who could fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The ballroom, by this logic, defined the country's aristocracy. The aristocracy, by the same logic, existed at the pleasure of a 58-year-old wife of the New York real estate interest, who wore a great many pearls and gave a ball on the third Monday of every January. There is, in the American reaction to the phrase, something that ought to be paused over. The country in which the 400 entered the popular vocabulary had, less than 100 years earlier, fought a war to reject the notion that any human being was inherently the social superior of any other. Its founding documents contained explicit prohibitions against the granting of titles. Its populist newspapers, throughout the 1880s, denounced the aristocratic pretensions of the Astors and their friends with a satirical energy that has not since been matched. And yet, this is what has to be noticed. The same country, in the same decade, produced, over the course of a decade, a phrase whose implicit function was to distinguish 400 families from the remaining 60 million Americans on the basis of nothing more than their invitation to a certain ballroom. It produced more, an insatiable public appetite for knowing exactly who those 400 families were. Caroline Astor had understood, apparently by intuition, that the republic which had abolished formal titles would, in their absence, invent an informal system of exclusion so intricate that no Habsburg court chamberlain could have designed it. She had understood it, and she had, in the ballroom on Fifth Avenue, provided it with a home. Ward McAllister was, in the summer of 1888, more famous than he had ever been. He was also, though neither he nor his patroness could yet have known it, at the beginning of his own long slide. For 4 years after the Tribune interview, the American press asked, on any occasion at which it could think of asking, for the names. Ward McAllister for 4 years did not give them. He gave them at last in the winter of 1892, in the run-up to another of Mrs. Astor's balls. He had been contending in the same weeks with a rival list published in the New York World, which had suggested that New York society consisted, in truth, of no more than 150 families, and which had had the further impertinence of naming them. McAllister had been affronted. He had spoken to the New York Times. On the 16th of February, 1892, the Times had published, on his authority, the official list of the 400. The list was, when the counting was done, 319 names long. The reader may pause on that number. Almost none of the millions of Americans who spoke of the 400 over the following century ever knew it. The 400 were, in the actual list, 319. They were, moreover, in their composition, considerably less aristocratic than the phrase had suggested. There were bankers, there were lawyers, there were brokers, there were railroad men, there were real estate men who were, in every particular, the class from which the Astor family itself had risen. There was one editor, Paul Dana of the New York Sun, there was one publisher, there were 2 architects, there was one artist, there was Ward McAllister himself. The list was, in every respect, exactly what its publication would suggest. It was the list of the people whom the man who had drawn it up wished to be known to have known. It was, as one of Mrs. Astor's colder observers remarked at the time, a monument to the vanity of the man who had made it, rather than a monument to the exclusiveness of the class it described. The publication of the list did 2 things at once. It confirmed in the minds of everyone who read it that the 400 was a real thing, with a fixed membership. And it began, in the minds of everyone whose name was on it, the slow suspicion that the man who had leaked those names had made a mistake. He would not be forgiven. Some of them were resentful for reasons of privacy. Some of them were resentful for reasons of dignity. Almost all of them were resentful for the reason, which they did not always name, that the list had been given to the vulgar press. Ward McAllister had, in his patroness's private evaluation, crossed the line from being an instrument to being a subject. He would not, over the following 3 years, be forgiven. There is, before we come to McAllister's slow disgrace, one story that we must return to. It is the story with which this account began, the story of the 26th of March, 1883, and of the fancy dress ball at 665th Avenue. The mansion at that address had been built, over the preceding 3 years, at very great expense, for a young woman named Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt. Alva had been born in Mobile, Alabama, in 1853. Her father had been a cotton broker, of respectable but by no means aristocratic means. She had grown up during the Civil War years in Paris, where her mother had taken the children in search of a more affordable exile than New York would have provided. She had returned to America a young woman of very considerable ambition and no obvious way of realizing it. In 1875, at the age of 22, she had married William Kissam Vanderbilt, the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the elder Vanderbilt, universally known as the Commodore, who had made at the time of his death in 1877 a railway and shipping fortune in excess of $100 million. The Vanderbilts were, at the time of Alva's marriage, several times richer than the Astors. What they were not, and had never been, was fashionable. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the founder of the fortune, had been a Staten Island ferry boatman who had spoken all his life in the accent of the New York docks. His son William Henry, the father of Alva's husband, had inherited both the fortune and the accent. In the private judgment of Caroline Astor's world, the Vanderbilts were, whatever their bank balances, unmistakably new. New meant, in the vocabulary of Fifth Avenue in the 1870s, not yet placeable. And not yet placeable meant, for the purposes of Mrs. Astor's writing desk, not yet invited. Alva Vanderbilt had, from very early in her married life, decided that this exclusion was intolerable and could be defeated. Her instrument of defeat was to be the mansion at 665th Avenue, the Petit Chateau, which she and her husband commissioned in 1878 from the architect Richard Morris Hunt, and which, by the beginning of 1883, was ready to be opened. The opening was to take the form of a fancy dress ball on the 26th of March, at the beginning of the Lenten season. A word of explanation about the calendar. In the aristocratic New York of the 1880s, the Christian season of Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was, by an old convention, a period of relative sobriety. Balls were postponed, public entertainment was reduced. A ball given on the eve of Lent was, in that specific sense, a final gesture before a formal fast. It was also, in Alva Vanderbilt's specific case, a ball designed to make it impossible for anyone in New York society to pretend the Vanderbilts did not exist. 1,200 invitations were issued. They were engraved on the finest paper the New York stationers could produce. They were delivered by hand, by liveried footmen. Alva, in a decision that would prove significant, invited journalists to preview the decorations of the house in advance. New York's newspapers, in the week before the ball, ran breathless daily columns on the flowers that had been shipped in from Bermuda, on the champagne that had been ordered from Reims, on the costumes that were being sewn in the workrooms of Worth in Paris and delivered, at extreme cost, on the fastest steamships available. The city was, by the middle of March, incapable of talking about anything else. Among the young women of New York society who had begun, some weeks earlier, to practice the quadrille that was to open the evening was Carrie Astor, Caroline's youngest daughter, then 21. She had, with a group of 6 other girls, rehearsed the figures at intervals through the winter. She had a costume prepared. She had chosen her jewelry, and her invitation, for reasons that only Alva Vanderbilt understood, had not arrived. Every one of the friends with whom Carrie had rehearsed the quadrille received hers. She did not. In the last week before the ball, she asked her mother whether some inquiry might not be made. Caroline Astor, upon making the inquiry, through intermediaries in the manner of her generation, was informed by return of the reason. Mrs. Vanderbilt regretted, but she was unable to send an invitation to a young woman whose mother had never called upon her in her home. She had, she pointed out, no address to which she could send the card. She was ready, she implied, to correct the omission if Mrs. Astor were ready to correct hers. On the afternoon of the 25th of March, 1883, Mrs. Astor, without a word to any observer that has survived, went to her carriage. She was driven north along Fifth Avenue. She stopped at the Petit Chateau. She left her card. She went home. The card was accepted. The invitation for Miss Caroline Schermerhorn Astor of number 355th Avenue arrived the following morning. The ball that Monday evening was everything the newspapers had promised. The house was hung with orchids from South America. Alva Vanderbilt received her guests dressed as a Venetian princess in the manner of Cabanel, in a costume whose value was estimated by the New York Times at $11,000. Her husband, William K., was dressed as the Duke of Guise. Her sister-in-law, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, the wife of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, appeared in a costume representing electric light, whose torch was fitted, by an early ingenuity of American engineering, with actual electric bulbs powered by a battery concealed in the folds of the skirt. Ward McAllister was in attendance in the costume of the Comte de la Mole. Mrs. Astor arrived with her daughter at 10:30 in the evening in a dark court gown of no particular theatrical intention. She was received by Alva Vanderbilt at the door. She was cordial. She was correct. She stayed, according to the newspapers, until sometime after 2 in the morning. She said nothing to any reporter about what she thought of the evening. The doors of Mrs. Astor's ballroom at Fifth Avenue opened in the seasons that followed to Alva Vanderbilt. They opened in the fullness of time to Alva's daughter Consuelo, who would in 1895 be married to the 9th Duke of Marlborough at St. Thomas Church across the street from 355th Avenue. They opened in the years after that to almost every family who had, at the time of the Petit Chateau, still been categorized on Caroline Astor's writing desk as new. The old peerage of Fifth Avenue had, on the afternoon of the 25th of March, 1883, admitted its first American Duchess in embryo. It would not recover. There would come in the years that followed another challenge, and this one from inside Mrs. Astor's own house. On the 22nd of February, 1890, William Backhouse Astor's elder brother, John Jacob Astor III, the head, in a strict genealogical sense, of the entire American Astor family, died in his mansion on Fifth Avenue at the age of 67. His son, William Waldorf Astor, was 42. He was, by every criterion that either English or American aristocratic tradition would have applied, the new head of the family. He had, moreover, a wife, Mary Dahlgren Paul of Philadelphia, whom he considered with a certain private tenderness to be, by every principle of primogeniture, the new Mrs. Astor. He informed his uncle's widow of this position in the courteous but unmistakable phrases of a man who did not expect to be contradicted. He was contradicted. Caroline Astor, then 59 years old, had for very nearly 40 years been known in New York simply as Mrs. Astor. She had used, on her cards and in her correspondence, no first name and no husband's initial. She had done this from a considered position, the position that in her own generation of the family, she was the mistress of a house in which no first name and no initial were required to distinguish her. She was, in short, the Mrs. Astor. Her nephew's wife, whatever the genealogy of the family, would have to find, in her opinion, another form of address. She said none of this in public. She did not need to. She continued on her cards and in her correspondence to use the same name she had used since her marriage. William Waldorf, from the corresponding position across the family, wrote her a letter. He asked her, in the phrases in which he had been trained, to henceforth style herself Mrs. William Astor, in accordance with the genealogical facts. She did not reply. The letter was, in his own account, produced later before society and to the amusement of some of its members. The press, over the winter of 1890, learned of the correspondence. It attached itself to the story with the enthusiasm the American press had, by that date, developed for any interior conflict of the Astor family. And it began on its own initiative to distinguish the two women in its columns by a small but permanent innovation. It began to refer to Caroline as the Mrs. Astor. The definite article in the American press of 1890 was intended as a small courtesy to William Waldorf's wife. It was accepted in the newspapers of the following season as the settled name of Caroline. She had, without quite intending it, been given by her enemies the title she would carry into history. William Waldorf did not accept the outcome. He withdrew in the autumn of 1891 to England. He took his wife and his 4 children. He settled at first in London, then, in the years that followed, at Cliveden and at Hever Castle, both of which he purchased and restored. He became a British subject in due course in 1899. He was made in the war years a British peer, Baron Astor in 1916, Viscount Astor in 1917. He would die at Brighton in October 1919, having spent the second half of his life at a distance from the country of his birth. Before he left New York, however, he did one last thing. In 1893, he arranged for the demolition of his father's mansion on Fifth Avenue, the mansion he had inherited in 1890, which stood, by a peculiarity of history, directly next door to Caroline Astor's own house at number 350. In its place, he commissioned the architect Henry Hardenberg to build a hotel. It was to be 13 stories tall. It was to be the tallest and most luxurious hotel in the city. It was to be called the Waldorf. It opened to a great deal of publicity on the 13th of March, 1893. It had 450 guest rooms. It had electric lights in every suite. It had bathrooms attached to every bedroom, which was, in the American hotels of the 1890s, an innovation not far short of revolutionary. It had marble staircases, imported antiques, a palm garden, and a restaurant called the Empire Room. It also, quite deliberately, had a solid brick wall running the full length of one side of the house next door. The house next door was Caroline Astor's. The house next door had, until the spring of 1893, looked out onto Fifth Avenue in the ordinary way. It now looked out onto the service entrance of a 13-story commercial hotel, past which, in a stream that would, by the end of 1893, be more or less continuous, moved the delivery vans, the bus, the guests, the servants, and the assembled curiosity of a public whose interest in seeing what the Mrs. Astor's house looked like from the outside was, in the American vocabulary of the 90s, insatiable. She was said by an associate who had a good ear for her phrasing to have observed that a glorified tavern had been put up next door. The remark, if she made it, was in every particular characteristic. It contained no complaint. It named no antagonist. It reduced the fact of the Waldorf, whose 13 stories of German Renaissance masonry were, in the spring of 1893, the most talked about building in New York, to the level of a village public house that had, by an oversight of the local authorities, been permitted to be built next to a decent home. It was not a phrase that would appear in the newspapers of the following morning. It was a phrase, however, that would circulate in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue in Newport for the rest of that summer, and that would establish, for the last time before the invention of new instruments of exclusion, the exact character of Caroline Astor's mind. She did not stay to endure it. In the same year, together with her son Jack, she made her decision. The mansion at 350 Fifth Avenue would be sold. A new house would be built for her further north, at the corner of 65th Street. It would be designed by Richard Morris Hunt. It would be, in fact, a double mansion, a great Loire chateau of 2 connected houses. She would inhabit the northern half at number 841 Fifth Avenue. Her son and his family would inhabit the southern half at number 840. The 2 houses would share a ballroom whose capacity would be, in the private opinion of the men who built it, comfortably in excess of 400 people, and whose ceiling would carry, in gilded plaster, the initials of the Astor family in every visible corner. It would be, in every particular, an admission that the old world of Lower Fifth Avenue had ended, and a decision to build, further up the avenue, a smaller and less exposed version of it. Before she moved, however, one more thing was to happen. In fact, it was to happen almost at once. Because in the same spring in which the Waldorf opened its doors next door to her mansion, another disaster of a different kind arrived at Caroline Astor's writing desk. The disaster came in three parts. On the 25th of April, 1892, in a hotel room in Paris, the Hotel Liverpool, on the Rue de Castiglione, Caroline's husband, William Backhouse Astor, Jr., died suddenly of an aneurysm. He was 62. He had not, for the past decade, been much at home. He had spent his life, as we have seen, on his yacht in Florida, at his stud farm at Ferncliff, at the racetrack. He had been, by the reckoning of his own household, a slightly absent husband and a distant father. He was also, at the moment of his death, one of the 2 or 3 richest men in America. His will, when it was read, contained a considerable surprise. He had left almost the whole of his fortune to his son, Jack, who was, by the terms of the will, made at the age of 27, the richest man in America. He had left, to his other surviving children, comparatively small settlements. He had left to his second daughter, Charlotte, for reasons which will presently become clear, nothing at all. The reason presently became clear because it had been, for months already, the subject of the New York and London papers. Charlotte Astor Drayton, then 34 years old, had been married for 13 years to a Philadelphia lawyer named James Coleman Drayton, with whom she had had 4 children. Beginning in the winter of 1890, and in circumstances which the press covered with the enthusiasm of a public that had by then decided the Astor family was its property, she had been reported to be spending a great deal of time in London with a young New Yorker named Hallett Alsop Borough. Drayton had, in the summer of 1891, discovered the phrase is the one used in the press of the time, the letters. He had followed his wife to Europe. He had in Paris in the spring of 1892 challenged Borough to a duel. Duels were by the 1890s a formality. The seconds negotiated at length and, in the general run of cases, arrived at an arrangement by which no shots were exchanged. Drayton and Borough followed the pattern. No shots were exchanged. What was exchanged in the same weeks, in every newspaper column that had a column to spare, was every private detail of the Drayton household, which, by the summer of 1892, was in a condition it could not repair. Charlotte's father, in the last months of his own life, had cut her from his will. Her brother Jack, on inheriting the fortune, gave her at once $1 million of his own. The divorce, which was granted in New York in 1896, took custody of the 4 Drayton children from their mother. She would in the same year marry a Scottish whiskey heir named George Ogilvy Haig, the elder brother of the future Field Marshal Douglas Haig, and would live thereafter in London and later in Paris, where she would die at the age of 62 in 1920. Divorce in the aristocratic New York of the 1890s was almost unheard of. It carried for a woman an almost total social eclipse. Divorced women in the seasons after the settlement ceased to be received. Their names disappeared from Ward McAllister's lists. Their friends in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue ceased to know them. For Caroline Astor, whose entire life's project had been the maintenance of a form of society whose implicit assumption was that respectability, once granted, was not to be surrendered, the divorce of her third daughter was, in the strict private sense, a catastrophe. It was not one, however, that she permitted herself to acknowledge. Her mother, throughout the years of the divorce, said nothing publicly. She continued to give her Monday night balls. She continued to keep, on her writing desk, the list of the families to whom the invitations would be sent. She continued to preside at Newport in the summers, at Beechwood. She was, on the 25th of April, 1892, 61 years old, a widow, the mother of a divorcing daughter, and, in the American press, more famous than she had ever been. In the New York in which she had lived her whole life, none of these 3 facts were separable. They were, in the aggregate, what she was. She continued. The following spring, in the year in which the Waldorf opened, Ward McAllister paid the price for his book. He had published it in 1890 at Cassell in New York. Society as I Have Found It, 469 pages of reminiscence, gossip, opinion on entertaining, and thinly veiled description of the parties of his patroness. He had done this, according to the friends who knew him best, partly for the attention, partly for the money. A life on the fringes of very great fortunes had not, over the years, made him rich. And partly because he had convinced himself that his own contribution to the aristocratic society he had helped to construct deserved to be preserved in print. It was, in this last respect, a serious miscalculation. The reaction of that society was swift, silent, and total. The women who had been described in his pages, some of them by name, some of them by the transparent screen of a first initial A, read the book and were furious. The men who had been described in the same pages, many of them patriarchs, some of them by then dead, were, in the persons of their sons and grandsons, no less so. Ward McAllister had, in every drawing room whose invitations he had for 2 decades composed, ceased to be received. He did not at first understand the extent of what had happened to him. He continued for a time to give interviews. He continued to imagine that the storm would pass. In 1892, in the affair of the leaked list to the New York Times, he made his second and greater mistake. Caroline Astor never spoke to him again. He fell, in the last 3 years of his life, into a decline that friends who saw him remembered as complete. He was still received at his club, the Union, but at a slowly diminishing number of tables. On the evening of the 31st of January, 1895, at the Union Club, according to accounts published in the newspapers of the following week, he sat down to a solitary dinner. He rose at some point in the meal in the direction of the reading room. He collapsed on the way. He died of what was diagnosed at the time as an acute inflammation of the digestive organs. Later that night, he was 67. His funeral, which had been in his own life a subject of much unspoken planning, was almost entirely unattended by the society whose lists he had composed. One of Mrs. Astor's cooler observers, when asked by the Times about McAllister's passing, is said to have replied that what a pity it was that he had written a book. Mrs. Astor was not at the funeral. She was not, so far as any surviving record shows, ever heard to speak his name again. She moved in the same year into the northern half of the new mansion at 841 Fifth Avenue. Its ballroom on the ground floor could hold a great many more than 400 people. Its dining room could seat 200. It contained in its salons the Carolus Duran portrait of her from 1890 and the Cabanel purchases she had made in Paris on her honeymoon 42 years earlier, and above the drawing room fireplace, the diamond stomacher in its case. She gave, in that ballroom, 7 annual balls between 1895 and 1905. The last of them, on the 3rd Monday of January, 1905, brought together for the last time much of what remained of the old society. Even by that year, however, the world she had constructed had begun to be replaced. Ward McAllister's role, or its shadow, had been divided among 3 women, none of whom she had ever quite approved of. Marion Gravesend Fish, known as Mamie, had begun to give, at her house on Madison Avenue, dinners at which the food was served at inhuman speed and at which the elderly patriarchs of the old system were made to feel foolish. Teresa Fair Ulrichs, born in Virginia City, Nevada, into the silver mining fortune of the Comstock lode, had become, at Newport, the arbiter of the summer. And Alva Vanderbilt, now since her divorce and remarriage, Alva Belmont, had, from the same drawing room she had once tried to enter, established herself as the militant reformer of the very rules Caroline Astor had spent her life defending. Each of the 3, in her own way, represented an end of the world Caroline had constructed. Mamie Fish gave her guests the shock of speed. The old society had been slow. Teresa Fair Ulrichs brought to the summer at Newport the ostentation of the Western silver fortunes. The old society had been, in every one of its details, restrained. Alva Belmont had, upon her divorce from William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1895, ceased to be received in a considerable number of the drawing rooms she had once been anxious to enter, and in her characteristic response, had ceased to want to be received. She had turned her formidable energies in the closing years of the century to the American suffrage movement, and would eventually give a great deal of the Vanderbilt fortune to the campaign for women's votes. It was, in its own particular way, a form of revenge on the world of Caroline Astor's ballroom. It was also, in every way that mattered, a repudiation of the entire system that ballroom had represented. The 400 in the year of her last ball were no longer 400. They were, in every practical respect, obsolete. She herself in that year was 75 years old. She had been the Mrs. Astor for 15 years and, in a functional sense, for very much longer than that. She was said, by those who saw her at the ball, to be as composed as she had ever been. She wore the diamond stomacher. She received her guests at the door. At some point in the small hours of the morning, after the last carriage had departed, she began to climb the great staircase to her private rooms upstairs. Her maid was, as she often was, several steps behind. On the third or fourth landing, according to the accounts that emerged from the household in the days that followed, Mrs. Astor stumbled. She was caught in the fall by the balustrade. She was helped by the maid to her feet. She was taken to her room. A doctor was sent for. She had broken her hip. She would not, in the 3 years that remained of her life, walk without assistance again. She was, from that morning onward, confined for most of her hours to a wheelchair in the small drawing room adjacent to her bedroom. Her memory in those 3 years was said by her friends who visited her to have begun to soften. She spoke sometimes to guests who were long dead. She spoke sometimes to Ward McAllister as though the estrangement of 1892 had never occurred. She gave, from her wheelchair, instructions about balls that would never be held. She specified the guests. She revised the lists. She continued in her own settled evening to preside over a society that had been dissolving around her since the day she had first paid a call at the Petit Chateau, and that had quietly ceased to exist. She died in her own bedroom at 841 Fifth Avenue on a gray morning at the end of October, 1908. She was 78. The funeral was held at the house and was attended by a great many of the surviving grandchildren of the New York families, whose names had for so long been on her list. She was interred at Trinity Church Cemetery in the Hamilton Heights section of Upper Manhattan. Her daughter Carrie, over the following 2 years, arranged the erection above the grave of a marble monument 39 feet high. 3 years and 6 months after her death, on the 15th of April, 1912, her only son, Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, drowned in the North Atlantic Ocean at the age of 47 in the sinking of the RMS Titanic. He had, some months earlier, married a young woman named Madeline Talmadge Force, whom he had met at a Newport summer party the year after his mother's death. Madeline had been 18 and pregnant when they boarded the ship. Jack had put her into lifeboat number 4, kissed her, and returned to the deck. She survived. Their son, John Jacob Astor VI, was born 4 months later. Whether Jack Astor thought in the last minutes on the deck of the ship of the mother whose name he had inherited and of the ballroom in which he had grown up is not something we shall ever know. The mansion at 355th Avenue, which she and her husband had built as newlyweds in 1862, and in which her career as the Mrs. Astor had been, in every essential particular, constructed, was demolished in 1928. On the site was erected, over the following 2 years, the Empire State Building, which for the following 40 years would be the tallest structure on the earth. The Waldorf Astoria, the merged monument to her family's own private quarrel, was demolished in the same period and was replaced by a new hotel of the same name on Park Avenue, 13 blocks to the north. Of the double mansion at 65th Street and 5th Avenue, into which she had moved in the year of Ward McAllister's disgrace and in which she had spent her last years, nothing remains. Her son converted the 2 connected houses into a single residence after her death, and following his own death on the Titanic, the building passed out of the family. It was demolished in the same period of the 1920s as the other Astor properties. The site is today occupied by Temple Emmanuel. Passers-by in that portion of Fifth Avenue, walking north from the Metropolitan Museum on a Saturday afternoon in autumn, may look up at the plain limestone facade of the great synagogue and see nothing of what stood there before it. This is, in the American vocabulary of memory, ordinary. What remains of the Mrs. Astor in the New York of the 21st century is a phrase, the 400. It appears still in books, in editorial pages, in the copy of estate agents advertising apartments on the Upper East Side. It is used occasionally by writers who have never heard the name of Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, in ways that would have astonished her and perhaps quietly pleased her. It is the last surviving instrument of an authority she constructed, over 40 years, by refusing to explain the rules by which she was working. She had understood from very early that the point of an aristocratic society was not to admit, it was to exclude. She had understood from equally early that the exclusion had to be conducted without ever being written down. When the writing down had at last occurred in the New York Times of the 16th of February, 1892, at the hand of her friend and instrument, Ward McAllister, she had understood at once that the system she had built had received the first of its fatal wounds. The Vanderbilt Ball of 1883, which had opened her ballroom to a woman she had not been prepared to receive, had been the second. The construction of the Waldorf, next door to her home, by a nephew she had not been prepared to displace, had been the third. She had, in each case, adjusted. She had moved uptown. She had opened her ballroom to the new families. She had given her Monday balls into her 75th year. She had not, in any surviving letter, complained. She had understood, in the last analysis, that the New York she had governed had, over the course of a single generation, ceased to exist. What remained at the end of that generation was a phrase. The phrase would be inherited by generations of Americans who had never seen the ballroom on Fifth Avenue, who had never spoken to a Schermerhorn or a Van Cortlandt, and who would, in most cases, never enter a house in which the Carolus Duran portrait of the woman who had made the phrase possible had ever been hung. They would use the phrase in editorials and in advertisements and in the private conversation of upper-middle-class Americans in Chicago and San Francisco and Boston to mean everything that Caroline Astor had spent her life trying to preserve, and that they had, in the world into which she had died, comprehensively lost. They would use it in the end as a memorial. Some empires in the end are ruled not by armies or by fortunes, but by the shorter of the two lists a woman has decided to keep on her writing desk.